So as Hans Ulrich would say, without further delay, sans plus de délai, on va commencer cet après-midi, qui est un après-midi encore tourné autour du thématique de la semaine qui est l'hospitalité. Et on a choisi la phrase de Derrida pour le titre de cet après-midi, qui va avoir plusieurs temps. L'hospitalité, l'ouverture à l'étranger, un événement unique, à chaque fois réitéré. Ça veut dire que chaque fois qu'on rencontre l'autre, c'est une nouvelle aventure qui commence. Et aujourd'hui, on a avec nous, pour commencer, Hans Ulrich Obrist, qui va se joindre à nous, et Paul Preciado, qui vont un peu être les modérateurs de cet après-midi. Dans un premier temps, on a Daniel Birnbaum, qui est le directeur du musée d'art moderne de Stockholm, Benmakhlouf, philosophe et universitaire, et Manthia Diawara, écrivain, réalisateur et aussi universitaire, pour commencer à traiter notre sujet. Hans Ulrich, it's your team. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much, Maria. And maybe before starting and introducing the speakers, a few preambles, a few comments, and above all, a few thank yous. I wanted to foremost, of course, thank Maya Hoffman. It's Maya's vision who brings us here all together. And the theme of this afternoon really leads us back to the very beginning of where the LUMA project Arles started. The idea of hospitality, of also generosity, lies at the very beginning of the earliest conversations Maya started about this new institution. And we want to focus today particularly, I think, also on Edouard Glissant, because he has been an inspiration, I think, for the LUMA Arles project from the very, very beginning, not only through the themes of hospitality and generosity, but also through his ideas of how an art institution in the 21st century could work as an archipelago. So before starting, I wanted to ask you all to give a very big applause for Maya Hoffman. I also wanted to say that this afternoon is a co-curated afternoon with Paul Preciado, and wanted to ask you all to give Paul Preciado a very warm welcome. I want to thank also the amazing LUMA Arles team for organizing all of this. A big applause. And also thank, of course, the core group, Tom Eccles, Liam Gillick, Philippa Reno, and Beatrix Ruf. A very big applause for them. And also a big applause for Maria Finders, of course, for organizing everything, bringing us all together, masterminding these LUMA Days. When Maria spoke about, in the general introduction, about the idea while geography and circumstances frame the journey between the guest and the host, we of course started to think about the territory, between the zone of potential exile and exploration becoming the map, the common ground which we can share. So this, of course, is a frontier of transition, of exchange, and we see it not as a danger, but we see it as a source of inspiration and challenge, as we discussed with Paul Preciado in conversations preparing today's program. I wanted to say that, of course, an inspiration was and always is Daniel Birnbaum's book, Hospitality of Presence. And I wanted to, and I'm going to do this all in English because Edouard Glissant says we always need multilingualism. As Maria said, we have translation. So for those of you who want it in French, there is translation. And of course, in the Q&A afterwards, you can ask your questions also in French. So it's perfectly bilingual. And today the focus will be on English, and tomorrow will be on French. Edouard Glissant told us that every conference somehow should embrace multilingualism. So we're very happy to have many languages here. So to come back to the hospitality of presence, when I was a student and moved to Paris, I actually went to see Paul Ricoeur, the legendary philosopher. It was in the 90s. He was very old at the time, and we had to schedule this meeting for months and months, and he said he would only have 30 minutes for me because he was almost 90 years old, and he had still more than 10 books to write, so he couldn't really lose time, for a conversation. So I arrived at his door on a damp and very cold day, and he led me to the kitchen, and we had a wonderful conversation on surrealism, on the trajectory, of course, which led to his famous lectures on utopia and ideology, which was a great inspiration for Molly Nesbitt and for Rickrit, who is here today to, of course, do Utopia Station, and also on his impressions of German ideology, because Ricker was a prisoner of war in Germany during the 1940s. And of course, we discussed also his projects he was working on at the moment, particularly to engage with the residue and omissions from his completed work. I then sort of, towards the end of my 30 minutes, which is quite fast if we run out of time, I asked him a last question, and I wanted to know who are somehow the younger philosophers the 90-year-old Paul Ricoeur finds inspiring. And he didn't hesitate a second. He said there is this young Swedish philosopher, Daniel Birnbaum, and you must read him. And I, of course, was already friends with Daniel, and it was a wonderful moment. And he mentioned the thesis, of course, Daniel had written, The Hospitality of Presence, which includes this wonderful passage from Husserl's meditation of 1929, where he speaks of the necessity for intersubjective monadology. And what is intersubjective monadology? Intersubjective monadology, according to Husserl, is the idea that you only become who you are, and that we all only become who we are in relation to others. And that, of course, is very much at the core of what these conversations here, what these LUMA Days are about. And a distinguishing feature of this study, of Daniel's thesis, is, of course, also that Husserl was hardly a fashionable inquiry in the 1990s, but there were a lot of interesting links. Jean-François Lyotard's first book, of course, deals with Husserl, and Derrida's first 3 books were all on Husserl. So when, Maria quotes Derrida as an inspiration, these 3 books all had to do with this theme of hospitality in relation to Husserl. And then, of course, Ricoeur never stopped referring to his work. Part of his thesis in 1950 was a French translation of Husserl's idea. But what I really want to talk about in this introduction is Édouard Glissant, because he is the main inspiration, and he always, of course, believed in this idea that we become who we are in relation to others. Édouard was born in Martinique in 1928 and died in Paris on February the 3rd, actually, a couple of years ago. So it's really very much one of the great thinkers of the 20th century, who for me is the greatest toolbox. I read him every morning. So when I wake up, no matter when I wake up every day, I read 50 minutes of Édouard Glissant. So one way or the other, every single thing I've been doing over the last 20 years has been deeply inspired. And I kind of came across, it has been really deeply inspired by Glissant's books, and he's the only author, one of the only authors, I've read every single line. And the great thing is that there isn't a bad line of Glissant. It's a way you can go in the earth or wherever you want. It's very inspiring, and that leads us to an experiment which Paul and I want to do here at the very end of today. So stay tuned, because at the very end of this afternoon, the lecture symposium format will dissolve into a participatory happening where hopefully all of you will participate by picking out some sentences and creating a collaborative text. So I came across Glissant through Boetti, and Boetti explained to me that his idea was of a non-homogenized globalization, that it's about finding ways how we can work globally without eradicating or erasing local differences. And we live in an age of extinction. Elisabeth Kolbert says it's a mass extinction. It's not only species disappear en masse, it's our own species which is threatened, but we have the disappearance of many cultural phenomena. And in a way, Boetti said we need to read Glissant, for our practice. A few years later, Agnes B. and Manthia thanked her yesterday because she really introduced us all and brought us all together. Agnes B. said, if you're so obsessed with Glissant, I want you to meet him. And she arranged, where else than at the Café de Flore, of course, a first meeting. And ever since, we have been discussing on an almost monthly basis, and he became my great mentor, and we've recorded hundreds of hours of conversation. One key feature, of course, is this idea, and that links it to LUMA and LUMA Arles and to Maya's vision for an institution, is this idea of an institution he wanted to found. Because in this idea of the archipelago, because Glissant was convinced that we needed to learn from the Antillean archipelago, and its geography is very important. To quote him here, the American archipelagos are important because it was in these islands that the idea of creolization, which means the blend of cultures, was most brilliantly fulfilled. As Glissant wrote, it's continents which reject mixings, whereas archipelagic thoughts make it possible to say that neither each person's identity nor the collective identity are fixed and established once for all. And that leads him to the conclusion that I can change through exchange with the other. So I can change through the exchange with all of you without losing or diluting my sense of self. And really that is what we can learn from the archipelagic logic, and leads us fully back to the theme of hospitality. Now, Glissant wanted to apply this to a 21st century institution, and he founded a school, which was the Institut Martiniquais d'études, which influenced an entire epoch. It's a bit like a Black Mountain College, one can say. It was a school out of which poets, architects, artists emerged, and it's unfortunately less known than the Black Mountain College. So we need to really remember this amazing école. But then he wanted to build an art institution. Like Maya, he had this idea that he wanted to create an interdisciplinary art institution where basically he wanted to bring together artists like Wilfredo Larm and Roberto Matta, who were his friends, together with history. He wanted to have it from the Mayas to the present. To quote him here, the basic idea was that I had always wanted to put together a historical or comparative encyclopedia of the arts of the Americas. So the archipelago was a model. It was the museum not as a continent, but as an archipelago, and that's the key now. So it means it would not house a synthesis, because a synthesis, he said, serves to standardize. And then we are back to the homogenization. And he says many Western institutions aim at the synthesis. So we should create a big institution which is not a synthesis, but as opposed to the synthesis, it is a network of interrelationship between people, between traditions, between perspectives. So the museum or the institution would not illustrate previously established findings, but it would function as an active laboratory. In Glissant's own words, it's not a recapitulation of something which existed in an obvious way, but it's the quest for something we don't know yet. And of course, this project was never realized, so it's an unrealized project, and I think we can learn from it for today, because in the end, the idea of bringing the world into contact with the world has never lost relevance. To bring some of the world's places into contact with other of the world's places. And so in this sense, we must multiply the number of worlds inside the institutions or inside the museums. And that leads us right away to this afternoon. We're extremely delighted to welcome our first three speakers, and I'm going to introduce them now very briefly, and we'll then hand over to Ali, who will speak first, and then to Daniel and Manthia. Ali Benmakhlouf is Professor of Philosophy at the University of Paris East in Créteil, Val-de-Marne, and also Professor at the Free University of Brussels. He's Associate of Philosophy and teaches Arabic philosophy and philosophy of logic at the University of Paris East, and also, of course, is very present in the intellectual life of Morocco, truly as a public intellectual. We can in this sense also learn from him the role of a public intellectual in the 21st century. He's the author of books on Averroes, on Montaigne, as well as on philosophers and logicians. Is also the chair of the advisory committee on ethics and ethics of the Institute of Development Research, and many, many more committees. The list is far too long here to quote it. I've already introduced Daniel Birnbaum, Paul Ricoeur's favorite young philosopher, an art critic, writer, theoretician, curator, and of course also the director of the Moderna Museet. The book Hospitality of Presence, Problem of Otherness, his thesis was published by Sternberg, and he has also directed numerous residency programs. And of course, and that leads us back to Glissant's school, the Städelschule in Frankfurt. Manthia Diawara you all know, because over the last couple of days, You've certainly attended at the 2 screenings. We've shown twice Manthia's visionary film of Édouard Glissant, which is the greatest document on the life of Édouard Glissant. It's an entire hour of interviews, and it's basically, I've always seen it so interesting when interviews happen on the move, and Manthia recorded a conversation with Édouard on the boat, crossing basically the sea. But of course, Manthia's work includes not only filmmaking, but also writing. He holds a chair at New York University where he teaches comparative literature and film, and is also the founder and director of the Black Renaissance Black publication, which is a bilingual magazine that publishes essays, short stories, literary and artistic critics about Africa and its diaspora, and has been one of the protagonists of last year's Documenta. And we actually met thanks to Édouard Glissant, because we were both together at the 80th anniversary of Édouard. When he turned 80, there was a birthday party in Paris, and there were like many people. And Édouard basically found Manthia and me, and he made it the aim of this evening, that he just said, you know, the 2 of you have to meet, and I'm eternally grateful to Édouard for doing that, because it was the beginning of a wonderful friendship. So now it's my immense pleasure to hand over to Ali Benmakhlouf. Please give Ali a very, very warm welcome.
Merci beaucoup Hans, merci à la Fondation de cette invitation. Ce qui nous réunit cet après-midi, c'est cette thématique de l'hospitalité. Je vais l'aborder à partir de questions tout d'abord tout à fait contemporaines. On parle beaucoup de la crise des migrants. Permettez-moi, en tant que sémanticien, en tant que philosophe du langage, dire qu'il y a une crise de l'accueil des migrants et non pas une crise des migrants. Ce n'est pas les migrants qui posent une crise, c'est qu'il y a une crise de l'accueil. Puisque les politiciens n'ont pu inventer dans leur imagination de rapport aux migrants que précisément l'enfermement, la multiplication des lieux de détention, de rétention, de zones d'attente où l'on place les étrangers refoulés à la frontière ou qui sollicitent l'asile, sans compter les prisons, et pas simplement les zones d'attente ou de rétention, les prisons où purgent leur peine ceux qui ont été condamnés pour défaut de papier ou refus de monter dans l'avion. Il y a donc toute une sémantique, je dirais, de l'euphémisation, puisqu'on dit zone d'attente, zone de rétention, une sémantique de l'euphémisation qui doit être dénoncée, parce qu'on parle de reconduite à la frontière, je disais de rétention, d'interdiction du territoire français, alors que tout ceci est très abstrait. Ce qui est réel, c'est la réalité de l'enfermement, les drames de la séparation, la peur qu'engendre le maintien dans ce que l'on appelle la clandestinité. Michael Edwards, qui est un professeur au Collège de France, britannique et français, il est très étonné quand il entend l'expression « on a trouvé des solutions d'hébergement ». Est-ce qu'on trouve des solutions d'hébergement, dit-il. J'entends ça à la radio, alors qu'il s'agit de démolition d'un campement de Paris. Je le cite, « L'information plongeait les auditeurs dans un monde tout à fait réel, dans un lieu de Paris dominé par le métro aérien, c'est autour de la Chapelle, avec des tentes qu'on arrache, des immigrants, des policiers, des cars qui s'en vont, en évoquant cependant non pas des salles de mairie, des gymnases, des foyers, ou, que sais-je encore, dit-il, des hébergements matériels, eh bien, on nous parle de solutions d'hébergement. Que peut signifier « on a trouvé », dit-il, des solutions d'hébergement. C'est ce que j'appelle, pour ma part, l'euphémisation de cette sémantique de l'enfermement. Maintenant, bien évidemment, je veux, après cette brève introduction, indiquer combien nos vies sont en conférence les unes avec les autres. J'emprunte cette expression à Montaigne. Hans a souligné que j'avais fait un livre sur Montaigne. Nos vies sont en conférence les unes avec les autres. Montaigne disait cela pour dire qu'elles étaient en conversation. Et cette manière de souligner dès le XVIe siècle que nos vies étaient en conversation les unes avec les autres, me rappelle précisément ce que Édouard Glissant disait de la relation, à savoir que la relation relie, relate, relaie. La relation relie, relate, relaie, c'est une expression d'Édouard Glissant, où il entend précisément renouveler notre image de ce que l'on appelle et le métissage et la diaspora, le métissage n'étant pas pour Glissant précisément une façon de catégoriser racialement des gens, mais le métissage, c'est la métaphore de ce processus sans début ni fin de la relation. C'est un autre mot pour la relation, et la diaspora elle-même est beaucoup plus une mouvance culturelle déterritorialisée qu'une dispersion à partir d'une origine ou d'un centre. Et précisément aussi bien Glissant que Fanon, qui ont à la fois le regard du fils de la nation, si je puis dire, et la vision de l'étranger, ont insisté sur cette notion que nos vies sont en conférence les unes avec les autres, avec cette indication très forte, si vous voulez, cette notion de nos vies sont en conférence les unes avec les autres, c'est ce qui a donné toute une dynamique à Desmond Tutu au moment de la réconciliation en Afrique du Sud, parce qu'il a emprunté aussi cette thématique-là en disant que nos vies sont dans un faisceau de vie, qu'en réalité, il faut toujours parler de l'interaction qui est première et non pas tel ou tel individu supposé dans son lieu et l'autre supposé comme étranger. Je cite Desmond Tutu, « Mon humanité est inextricablement liée à la vôtre, nous appartenons au même faisceau de vie. Un être humain n'existe qu'en fonction des autres êtres humains. Je fais partie, je participe, je partage et je me sens, dit-il, rabaissé quand les autres sont rabaissés, je me sens rabaissé quand les autres sont rabaissés, je me sens humilié quand les autres sont humiliés, quand les autres sont torturés, opprimés ou traités comme des moins que rien. » Nous sommes bien évidemment liés les uns aux autres, non seulement par nos échanges économiques, sociaux, politiques, mais aussi par de vastes préoccupations qui nous concernent tous précisément, l'injustice, l'inhumanité qui défie notre monde, la violence, le terrorisme qui le menace, et même nos frustrations, dit Amartya Sen, prix Nobel d'économie d'origine indienne, même nos frustrations, quand vous vous dites « mais qu'est-ce que je peux faire ? Je me sens impuissant », même nos frustrations communes, notre sentiment partagé d'impuissance face aux enjeux globaux peuvent nous unir plus que nous diviser en raison du fait qu'il existe peu de non-voisins dans le monde. Il n'y a pas de non-voisins. Il faut cesser ce qu'il appelle l'incarcération civilisationnelle, compartimenter les gens en disant « vous appartenez au monde musulman, vous appartenez au monde asiatique », comme si le monde asiatique était monolithique, ou le monde africain. Il appelle ça l'incarcération civilisationnelle. Et cette incarcération civilisationnelle, justement, suppose que les cultures sont isolées alors qu'elles sont toutes en interaction les unes avec les autres, et que même le fait que je puisse m'attribuer une culture signifie qu'il y a plusieurs cultures. J'ai parlé de la sémantique de l'euphémisation, je voudrais parler aussi de la sémantique de l'envahissement. Ça vient de 1978, Margaret Thatcher, qui a dit « We are swamped », envahis par précisément des gens venant des Caraïbes et de l'Inde. Et depuis 1978, depuis 40 ans, cette thématique de l'envahissement s'est imposée précisément, alors qu'on peut très bien penser que ce ne sont pas on est submergé non pas par des individus qui viennent, mais on est submergé parfois par une culture sans que ces individus viennent. J'entends la gravitation qu'opère la culture américaine. Quand vous voyez arriver les grandes firmes, sans présence d'immigrés, eh bien, une culture peut submerger sans qu'il y ait des immigrés. Ça veut dire que, précisément, ce n'est pas sur la question de l'arrivée des immigrés, qu'on puisse parler la submersion ou l'envahissement. Pour terminer, parce que vous m'avez dit, Hans, qu'il faut aller très vite, je voudrais citer un passage de Glissant et de... un appel de Glissant et de Chamoiseau sur le fait que les frontières, qui sont normalement des moments de passage, deviennent de plus en plus des murs. Et, disent-ils, la tentation du mur n'est pas nouvelle. Chaque fois qu'une culture ou qu'une civilisation n'a pas réussi à penser l'autre, à se penser avec l'autre, à penser l'autre en soi, ces raides préservations de pierre, de fer, de barbelés, d'idéologies closes se sont élevées, effondrées et nous reviennent encore dans de nouvelles stridences. Ces refus apeurés de l'autre, ces tentatives de neutraliser son existence, même de la nier, peuvent prendre la forme d'un corset de textes législatifs, l'allure d'un indéfinissable ministère, ils ont écrit cela quand il y a eu le ministère de l'identité nationale en France, ou le brouillard d'une croyance transmise par des médias qui, délaissant leur esprit de liberté, souscrivent précisément à cette thématique. Et permettez-moi de dire que justement dans toute la thématique de l'esclavage qu'ils ont mise en avant, quand ils parlent des roulis des âmes et des corps dans l'océan, eh bien ce roulis des âmes et des corps, nous l'entendons aujourd'hui dans la mer Méditerranée, où précisément des Africains, des Asiatiques s'échouent avec leur espoir d'une vie meilleure, avec la tromperie d'une promesse, avec la peur d'une menace, et que ces hommes et ces femmes, parfois des enfants qui font naufrage ou meurent de déshydratation, d'étouffement, restent terriblement anonymes. Il n'y a pas d'archivage de ces vies sans deuil, de ces vies qui s'étouffent anonymement. Je conclus, dans notre monde contemporain, je disais, il y a peu de non-voisins, mais l'humanité est une espèce capable d'empathie. Montaigne disait que l'empathie, c'était l'imagination que donnent les vraies tendresses. Précisément, à chaque fois que l'humanité resserre ses liens, elle fait reculer les frontières de la justice. Quand on voit notre localité à partir des yeux du reste de l'humanité, et plutôt de se dire « il y a moi, et puis il y a ma rue, il y a mon pays, il y a le continent et l'horizon », partir de l'horizon et avoir la vue, disait Deleuze, le monde d'abord, le continent, l'Europe, la France, ma rue, moi, et dit-il, ce n'est pas une question de générosité ou de morale, c'est une question d'adresse postale. Essayons de changer d'adresse postale. Et ces énoncés ambulants que sont les migrants n'ont pas le droit de raconter leur épopée, ce sont des énoncés censurés, rejetés, exclus, mais c'est la parole européenne elle-même qui s'appauvrit, puisque si le même se ferme sur lui-même et refuse l'autre, c'est le même, c'est l'identité qui devient monstrueusement autre. Je vous remercie.
Thank you so much, Ali. It's now my immense pleasure to ask Manthia Diawara on stage. A very warm welcome to Manthia.
Thank you very much, Hans Ulrich, and also thank you to Maria Finder, Maya Hoffman, Paul Presido, but also Florence Mai, who really went through all my crazy schedules. Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here. I want to start my presentation with about 5-minute clip from things that I put together on Edouard Glissant, and then the short time I come back and talk. So if you could please start with the clips.
la relation donc. Et il nous faut y revenir, comme à la splendeur qui à la fois relie, relaie et relate. Dans la relation, ce qui relie est d'abord la suite des rapports entre les différences du monde, venues à la rencontre les unes des autres. Les racines parcourantes, les rhizomes des idées, des identités, des intuitions, relaient, constituant le tissu du vivant et la toile des cultures, où se révèlent les lieux communs dont nous avons parlé et que nous partageons. Les poétiques, enfin, relatent. Elles ne racontent pas, elles disent. La relation se renforce quand elle se dit, quand elle dit. Ce qu'elle relate n'est pas une histoire, mais un état de monde, un état du monde. J'ai imaginé que la beauté se poste à la conjonction de tant de bouleversements et que ce que nous appelons l'esthétique en est d'abord la leçon non normative. La beauté nous indique le mouvement des différences et leurs rencontres. Des différents comme élément principal de la relation dans le monde. Le différent et non pas l'identique est la particule élémentaire du tissu du vivant ou de la toile tramée des cultures. Il est incontesté qu'une espèce vivante, clonée à l'infini, est une espèce qui s'arrêterait infiniment. Il est aussi évident qu'une culture humaine qui s'embrasserait soi-même à tout jamais et à soi-même seul est une culture qui n'embrasserait rien du monde et ne se délierait pas ni ne s'embraserait. Pour les humanités désormais, le feu fertile est à jamais conjoint. Les offenses faites à l'autre n'y changent rien et les solitudes de la personne humaine ne s'entourent plus de murs. L'autre n'est pas considéré seulement comme un différent, l'autre est considéré comme un contraire. Il n'y a pas de contraire dans le monde. Il y a des différences, ça c'est sûr, mais il n'y a pas de contraire. La dialectique des contraires suppose qu'il y a une vérité. Moi je dis, rien n'est vrai, tout est vivant. Les frontières étaient considérées comme nécessaires, naturellement nécessaires et naturellement infranchissables à l'époque où toutes les communautés du monde s'organisaient en nations. Et chaque nation devait avoir ses frontières, qu'elle cherchait d'ailleurs à élargir quand elle voulait s'étendre, quand la nation voulait s'agrandir. Et par conséquent, la frontière était d'abord le signal d'un « vous ne passez pas ». Je pense aussi que, paradoxalement, la frontière avait pour objet d'empêcher les gens qui appartenaient à cette nation de partir. On dit toujours que la Grande Muraille de Chine a été construite contre les invasions. Je ne le crois pas. Je crois que la Grande Muraille de Chine a été construite pour empêcher les Chinois de quitter la Chine. Mais aujourd'hui, la notion de frontière a changé de sens. On peut dire qu'aujourd'hui, les communautés s'envahissent mutuellement. Et que les notions de frontières sont à la fois beaucoup plus terribles et beaucoup plus fragiles. Et moi, je pense que, contrairement à ce qu'on pourrait croire, il faut en finir avec l'idée de la frontière qui défend, qui empêche, etc. Les frontières doivent être perméables. Elles ne doivent pas être des armes contre des processus d'immigration ou d'émigration. Mais je pense, ceci étant dit, que la frontière est nécessaire. Elle est nécessaire pour permettre d'apprécier le passage de la saveur d'un pays à une autre saveur d'un autre pays. Moi, je trouve extrêmement plaisant de passer d'une atmosphère à une autre à travers une frontière. Et par conséquent, ce qu'il nous faut aujourd'hui, c'est non pas abolir les frontières, mais donner aux frontières un autre sens, le sens d'un passage, d'une communication, c'est-à-dire d'une relation.
I wanted to show this clip, which is not part of the film, only the last statement is in the film. I put these clips together for another purpose, to really address the issue with hospitality in Edouard Glissant. Issue with hospitality, because of the time I have, I just want to deal with three aspects, very short aspects of time, intuition, and common ground in terms of this hospitality. Because I made a film called An Opera of the World, and one objective of this film was to see how to tremble with the trembling of other people. Glissant's argument behind what he called la pensée du tremblement is really to identify with, if you look at what's happening in the media today, not just see images of people drowning in the ocean, but to identify with the trembling literally, because he believes that the earth trembles, human beings tremble. And this trembling, this quakeful way of being in the world is also a language. And how do we identify with this language? Which is very, very important to Glissant. And he thought that there are three ways one could create identification and tremble with the trembling of the other. One was his argument about time. Time for him, in many ways, time creates a contemporaneity. You know, you have an extended time, a subjective time, but also you have very quick time. I was just mentioning television, where you see images passing of Syrians, of Africans. It's all very fast. It goes by second, 24 frames per second. But Glissant's argument is that all these times are contemporaneous. And therefore, how do we, and when one aspect of time suffers, it's the whole world, the human and the non-human living elements that suffer in this concept of time. And then he talks about intuition, which is also very important to this concept. He says thinking is too slow for intuition. Intuition does not rely only on memory or remembering. Forgetting is not detrimental to intuition. And intuition is something that comes through traces, that comes through trembling, that comes through relation, that comes through rhythm, that comes through what he calls, and that's difficult for me to translate, le vivant. Le vivant, sometimes I translate it with the living weft, but le vivant, que ce soit vivant in human beings or non-human being, and so on. And thinking, his best examples are, intuition comes through jazz, comes through beauty, comes through difference. Intuition is what guides our rhythm and improvisation, which is not a chance, but an intuitive science. Intuition is a philosophy of relation. Therefore, Glissant asked the question, could intuition be a philosophy? This is one of the things that he asked. If yes, how? And then he basically said, through poetry, through music, through literature, and through art. And then, why we need such a philosophy, I asked him. He says, first, to understand relations, and how understanding intuitive relation can lead us to a better understanding of our new humanities. He said intuition is in the structure of our evolution, and then I say, why study intuition? He says, because the rational objective and systematic studies of the living have long ignored intuition, have long ignored opacity. And then the last part, because I know that the clip took too long, the last part that is interesting to me as well, and this is really in terms of trembling, this is what happened to me recently. When I was growing up in Guinea, I'm from Mali, my father, and I'm really not being original here. In fact, many people said this. My father had an accent. I learned Mandingo. I learned how to speak Mandingo fluently. I didn't have an accent. But every time my father came to get me, he had a heavy Mandingo accent, and my friends laughed at me, basically. And I was really bothered by this for a long time. But now this is what I miss in human beings when I hear accents. This is the most beautiful thing for me now, just to go to places like this and hear different accents, you know. So this is one thing about la pensée du tremblement that's very, very important to me. My father's accent, and this comes with my last point, lieu commun. Lieu commun spelled avec un trait d'union, lieu et commun, as opposed to lieu commun, as you know in French, which is common ground, which is banal, which everybody knows. And Glissant made one statement about this that I will say this and I will stop. His point is that your most sacred intuition, that which that you think is yours, is inside you, is actually shared by people thousands of miles away from you. It's shared by people in Japan, it's shared by people in Mali, by people in the Caribbean. So what we need is really a solidarity between these intuitions, these lieu communs. This is basically what Glissant is saying, and I thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much, Manthia, and please give now a very, very warm applause and welcome to Daniel Birnbaum.
Thank you, Hans, and thank you to everyone organizing this very lively and interesting event. I will offer another accent, maybe a German or a Swedish. Hans Ulrich told me early on that this is clearly my theme, so I should be here. And that might be based a little bit on a misunderstanding, since I now look at the book I wrote, I started writing maybe 30 years ago when I was a philosophy student, and it is indeed called The Hospitality of Presence. It's a very technical book on phenomenology that I wrote when I was in my 20s still, and I was then maybe a bit of a schizophrenic person. I think maybe we all are, but in my case it was quite extreme that I spent all days in Husserl archive on Fifth Avenue in a very dusty basement with just a kind of neon light, and it was very boring in there, but I did spend many, many hours in there. Later in the evening, I got to know people in the art world and who more and more pushed me into that world, and I would say Hans is himself quite responsible for that move, and the people at Art Forum magazine. But now that I look at this book, I'm wondering, did I really write this? And I think I actually did. And the question would be, can I somehow bring that notion of hospitality into the kinds of hospitalities that we're talking about here? And I guess maybe I can. At least it is it's the same person who wrote it. And I'm thinking about another moment when I did work with the concept of hospitality, but on a very different level. And it has to do with another person who's present here during these days, who's Rirkrit Tiravania. And that was many years later when I was working at an art school in Germany, the Städelschule, and we kind of opened the school up to others, not just our other students. It was linked to the Documenta, actually, in 2002. And we invited hundreds, I think around 300 people from other parts of the world to live in the school. And it was a camp. It was a Gasthof. Gast in German means guest. So it was a kind of hospitable moment when our own students had to kind of leave, and they were quite upset for a little moment. But then they realized that this was an interesting thing. So it was about a kind of Gastfreundschaft, a kind of hospitality moment. And it was also a kind of secret preface to something that Rirkrit and Hans and Molly Nesbitt and a few others did just a year later, I think, called Utopia Station, which was actually a little bit the same idea, although this was a school event. But back to the notion of phenomenology. One could say that Husserl would be the very enemy to some of the thoughts that we are discussing here. At least there is there's a legacy, there's a history where we have a European, Eurocentric, humanistic, Derrida would say logocentric or phallocarno-logocentric kind of discourse, where Descartes would think that animals are machines and we are divided between mind and body, and the real thinking, the rationality is, objectifies everything outside and can suppress it, and it's also kind of basis for a certain kind of power discourse. What some people have done, and I was part of that movement maybe, was to look into some of these texts and find inner tensions and cracks in them and see that they're actually also saying the opposite. It's maybe a way to say what Derrida's deconstruction was all about, to look into texts and show that they are not totally coherent. There are other discourses in there. And in Edmund Husserl, who is a kind of late Cartesian thinker in one way, there are those cracks. One can say that phenomenology, he talked about it as a transcendental phenomenology, and transcendental, for those of you who have not studied philosophy ever, has very little to do with mysticism or yoga or transcendental meditation. It had to do with the kind of idea of conditions of possibility. It should be more fundamental than even empirical knowledge, such as physics or biology or chemistry or such things. It should be neutral and unproblematic. Of course, we can see that Husserl, a German Jewish thinker, was full of prejudices, and he was a very Eurocentric person, etc. But his ambition was to kind of look into what is common for all of us. At least that's the kind of ambition, the level of aspiration, or his aspiration. And deep down, we are subjects, but we are not closed off from others. exactly that which Hans started this little conference with is at the very basis of his thinking, that we are deep down also alien to ourselves. We have otherness inside us, and it's on, you know, it's a very technical kind of and complicated to a certain extent analysis, but we are not locked into a now, we are already ahead of ourselves, and we have memories. There's a temporal otherness built into the into subjectivity. We're also not first closed off thinking, does the world exist? Are other people human beings? We are already through certain kinds of empathy in the other, and the other make us who we are. So there's a kind of openness to otherness, and deep down we are otherness. And if we could not have that kind of relationship to ourselves as others, and to other people, and to other moments in time, and ultimately to other forms of life, we would not be subjects. So there's a kind of alterity at the center of identity. There's a kind of otherness that is maybe more fundamental than identity itself. And that, of course, is a condition for any kind of empathy or any kind of interest in otherness and openness and hospitality, etc. Deep down, we are not locked out. We are not locking things out. We are not atoms. We are intersubjective beings, and we otherwise we are psychotic and kind of sick, and we cannot kind of communicate with others. There's a kind of alterity which is more fundamental, and which is also the basis for any kind of hospitality towards otherness. Does that have anything to do with the world of art, institutions, schools, places like this? Maybe, maybe not, but I think it can be translated. And I was thinking a little bit about that moment when we opened up this old art school to people from all over the world and made it into a kind of a Gasthof. I think it's an interesting thing to kind of make a tabula rasa. And I'm not saying now to Maya Hoffman, who is starting this institution, that you have to kind of create a tabula rasa. First, we're building something. But if you take over an institution that is 200 years old, like the Städelschule, it can be interesting to create that kind of a, clean moment. And it can be a little bit of a shock therapy, basically, that, everyone out, now we're starting from the beginning. And I've tried that a little bit in other places. Then it's almost a decade ago, I took over one of the more legendary art collections in Europe, the Moderna Museet in Stockholm, a totally mini-MoMA kind of a Eurocentric super collection from Picasso to Cindy Sherman. Very little other discourses, but one of the best narratives when it comes to that. And to actually to empty the whole museum, which we did to everyone's kind of shock. We then did, the whole building only with sound, and then we did it only with the photographic imagery, and then we did it only with moving images, and then we, of course, started to build another kind of collection, and a more open collection to other, when it comes to gender, when it comes to geographical and ethnic kind of backgrounds. And that, of course, is not so original. Every intelligent museum tries to do that today, just to be part of our time. But it's interesting with these kinds of moments when you have to restart everything. And Gasthof was an interesting experiment, and I'm happy to see that a number of people who are here were actually involved with that. And Hans, you were one of them. And it was an interesting moment in an institution, but and it did, from there we could build it in a new way. However, I think that's something we will need to do, all of us here, maybe in 20 years, not now when we're starting. I think I stopped there, and of course it's hard to say that there's a kind of obvious bridge between technical phenomenological discourse and the analysis of institutions. And you were right, there were maybe 11 people who were interested in that dissertation, but thank God Paul Ricoeur was one of them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I don't know if you need microphones now.
Yeah.
Do we have more microphones?
But we can maybe.
Otherwise.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. I thought maybe to start with the first question, because in a way, the core of it all seems to be in relation to glissant, if it's possible to change through the exchange with the other without losing or diluting one's identity. And I think that somehow is at the core of so many things which are happening in the world right now. And I was kind of wondering if you can talk a little bit more about that. What are kind of possibilities to do so? What are toolboxes to do so? And I was also particularly curious in terms of, because we've been speaking about, Derrida, we've been speaking about Glissant. Of course, Derrida and Glissant had a major fallout, right? Fell out towards the very end of Derrida's life, famously at the Lago Maggiore. Glissant spoke about it to Manthia and me again and again. He was very upset. So I was kind of wondering, there must be other toolboxes today, because of course, both Glissant and Derrida are dead, so we were discussing last night, what could be living authors now who are toolboxes to achieve that, to change through the exchange with the other without losing or diluting one's identity. And of course, what are practices you see where that can be done? So I don't know who wants to start.
I will not answer. I will continue the question. Maybe one question about Glissant before we look into other possible toolboxes. The idea of translation as being something where 1 + 1 is not 2 but 3. I don't think he said that, but I have read some of the, for instance, the philosophy of relation, where it's really, that when languages are deleted or when they disappear, the world becomes a poorer and more dull place. But when a poem is translated into another language, it's not just a translation that is saved from one language and it reappears in another. Something new appears. This idea of the encounter between traditions, histories, languages, experiences, where constantly new things are produced. How do you understand that? Maybe I start with you, Manthia. Yeah.
Okay, let me see if I can approach the two questions. In many ways, the question of language is very important to Edouard Glissant. First, because of what Hans Ulrich just referred to, the rift between Glissant and Derrida. Derrida powerfully brought the supremacy of writing and even rewrote orality as texts in many ways, to the point that orality was becoming esoteric, the way some African return to the mother tongue and so on, or archived in some ways. Now, Glissant feels, after Derrida, that on the contrary, if you look at Latin America, African American writing, not so much in African writing, but orality is coming back if you also look at modernity. If you look at televisions, telephones, and so on. I was saying the other day that the way my brother, who never set foot in school, the way he communicates with me is to pick up WhatsApp and just talk in my language. He talks, before he used to go to someone to, can you write a letter for me to send to my brother? Now he can just talk to me in my language, and then if I don't respond, he could have some cultural element from my language sent to me as a way of talking to me. So orality is coming back in that way. Glissant saw it in the work of Garcia Marquez, in the work of Toni Morrison, in the work of Alice Walker, The Color Purple, but also in many authors where Faulkner, where you can see oral text actually re-emerging into written text. And Glissant's argument is that it's writing now who's threatened. If writing need to take on orality seriously. If writing does not take orality, because for Glissant, we are at the Baroque moment, and this is not a classical Baroque that we're talking about, but we're talking about the new Baroque that you see in Latin America, that we see now in Arles, where all these voices want to be heard at the same time. And this is why orality becomes very important to Glissant in many ways. But maybe I should let you answer the question of je peux changer en échangeant avec l'autre, sans m'échanger, ni me dénaturer. Yeah.
Yes. Can I answer by a phrase from Alice in Wonderland? It is a context of Alice in dialogue with the Duchess. And the Duchess said, never imagine yourself not to be. Otherwise, that what it might appear to others, that what you were or might have been was not otherwise, that what you had been could have appeared to them to be otherwise. So you have completely vertige, labyrinth. And I think that identity is always taken by first the difference, as you show in your movie. So the change in this fable, Alice in the Wonderland, she changed every time and very quickly. So I think it's the way to show to us that we are not always aware about all our changing because we think that something is just the same. I am the same man as something permanent, but it's a big illusion. And I think to answer your question about changing, it's important to have in mind these quick changings of a fantasy as made by Lewis Carroll, to be aware of our changing very quickly, very often, and not being completely in this illusion that something remains the same.
One thing you mentioned, Manthia, is of course the tremblement, no? The famous, Glissantian notion of the trembling. And Glissant told me that trembling is not uncertainty and it's not fear. Trembling thought, in my opinion, every utopia passes through this kind of thought. Is first of all the instinctive feeling that we must reject all categories of fixed thought. So it's the opposite of fixed thought, in a way. And it's interesting because Maria Finders, one of the very first questions she sent us, starting to conceive of these LUMA Days, was the question if, hospitality or construction of community is a utopia. And I think it's kind of interesting because Daniel mentioned the Gasthof, and of course at the Gasthof we tested with Rickrit and together with Liam Gillick and also Molly Nesbitt, the beginnings of Utopia Station, which is this evolving project which we're now going to revive or restart. And I think the question of utopia in relation to hospitality, in relation to the trembling, is something I wanted to ask you all about.
I got to know Ali in the car here, and since he has not mentioned the person he has mainly spent most time on, which is even more boring than Husserl, called Gottlob Frege, the founder of modern logics, I will just ask you a question that I asked you already then, and you kind of started, but maybe you can, apropos new toolboxes, because one often talks about 20th century philosophy as something that has gone through a linguistic turn. That before the turn of the century or late 1900, one thought about ideas and the mind and a philosophy of epistemology or different kinds. But regardless if you are interested in hermeneutics or in analytic language philosophy or whatever, it's still a kind of idea that language is at the base of our thinking. And this is the kind of 20th century key idea that didn't exist before. Maybe someone hinted at it, but that was the dominant paradigm. Was, I say now, already hinting that there would be something else. And when Hans Ulrich asks for other paradigms, I'm thinking, what are they today? And when you say trembling, I wonder what could that possibly be? I know Swedenborg wrote a book on trembling, but that's probably not it. But some sort of cosmological, maybe a philosophy of life of some sort. And I saw the last sentence in one of the chapters in what you showed said, I don't believe in truth, I believe in the living. Some sort of life philosophy. And I wonder if the linguistic turn is over. I mean, I don't think we get rid of it that quickly, but I wonder if there are other paradigms now that have more to do with the biological patterns, biological concepts, or a kind of framework, or computational, I presume, or other kinds. Are we still in this linguistic paradigm? And these are the grandest of questions, but I want what you think. And is Glissant possibly already anticipating something beyond that with this trembling life idea? Very easy question for you.
It's a very big question. But I think that all this temptation of having an Esperanto, artificial language, or artificial computer, or all these kinds, very far from our form of life. And as Manthia says about lieu commun, what you share really is a form of life, and you have to consider your language as un être vivant, as a living entity. And if you don't have this idea of language as a living entity, you will not be able to share anything with anyone. So this kind of language as living entity makes you feel aesthetics, go to museum, share your sensitivity, your sensations with many, because you share sensations with other people. And these sensations put you back to considering language as living entity. But there are many constructions in philosophy of logic, philosophy of sciences, to construct artificial languages, to have precise meaning, but all this is made for very restrictive, very particular fields. They cannot be a model or paradigm for sharing life and communicating with others.
Yeah, I'm very tempted by Daniel's idea of the end of the linguistic turn, but he's a philosopher, deconstructivist, so it could be a trap. But I'm very tempted by that. So I'm tempted, because Glissant goes to not linguistic, poetics, but through poetry, through Mallarmé. And the idea is to see how Latin American, Caribbean writers actually reposition both English, Spanish, and Portuguese in order to say new things. That's what he called the Baroque, the new Baroque, in many ways. So language is there, but again, it's coming through poetry as opposed to coming through philosophy. So I'm tempted, but I leave that to philosophers in many ways. And trembling is key. In many African cultures, specifically in my culture, which is Mandin and Soninke, West Africa, Mali, Senegal, all the way to Côte d'Ivoire, Guinea, Gambia, the saying is very clear: your guest is always better than you. Your guest, probably in the Arab cultures also, your guest is better than you. And then famously, Samben Ousmane's film, Molade, against female genital mutilation, the young girl runs into somebody's house, and the person put a rope, signifying that no one should cross that line in order to come and get the young woman and mutilate her, basically. But it's based on that concept of your guest being very, very important in many ways in the African cultures, but also probably, go ahead.
Yeah, can I quote something in Mediterranean culture in Greece? And it is Jean-Pierre Vernant who says, I will say it in French, because he speaks exactly about what you intend. He said, pourquoi les Grecs? Because he was a specialist of Greece. Pourquoi les Grecs? Parce que j'avais parcouru la Grèce à pied en 1935. J'avais trouvé ce pays magnifique. Dans nos pérégrinations à travers la campagne, nous, 4 jeunes gaillards en culottes courtes et sac à dos, étions accueillis par des paysans. Ils vous recevaient comme si l'étranger qui venait dans leur maison leur faisait leur plus grand honneur, le plus grand honneur. Lorsque nous arrivions sur les places des villages où il y avait les cafés, c'était la bagarre pour savoir qui nous emmènerait dans sa maison. Toutes les personnalités de ces petits bourgs voulaient nous inviter. Nous étions 4 et nous nous séparions pour que tout le monde soit content. Recevoir l'hôte étranger, plus qu'un devoir, apparaissait comme une chance. Une faveur divine, quelque chose de sacré, sacred, une faveur divine à ne pas laisser passer.
Non, absolument. En plus, glissant dit, il dit pour compléter la phrase ici d'Ali, que je préfère être celui qui traverse la frontière que celui qui garde la frontière. Et parce que celui qui traverse la frontière est plein d'idées, plein d'espoir, plein de je sais pas, projets pour le futur. Alors que celui qui garde la frontière n'a plus d'idées. Il est en train de sauvegarder ce qu'il a déjà. En Afrique, on préfère souvent s'affamer que de ne pas nourrir son étranger. Il faut donner tout ce que vous avez à l'étranger plutôt que de manger en cachette et puis venir voir l'étranger. Donc, oui.
I think there could not be a more wonderful conclusion, really, for this panel. So, thanks so much to Ali, to Manthia, to Daniel. Thank you very, very much.